I need a glass or a bell here to get everybody attention.
Good evening!
We'll have fun there. Can you tell who has a teacher voice on staff and who doesn't? Good evening. My name's Larry Bird, and I'm the executive director here at the Lew Wallace Study Museum, and we thank you all for coming this evening for our program. I would be remiss if I did not point out that we do have a membership program. If you're not a member, and I know it's preaching to the choir here, but if you're not a member, these are available. And one of the nice things about our membership programs is it makes a lot of the programs that we do during the year possible. So there is a list of what we've got scheduled. I don't think it's going to change much because it's very full and there's not very many Thursdays left in the year after you look at this. But these are also up by the refreshments that we'll have after the talk today. So feel free to grab one of these or check out our website. We're pretty good about keeping our social media up to speed. So check that out. We have Dr. Miller tonight, and then we have one other event in May, which is a book club, which is going to be an interesting one because we only use Indiana authors or Indiana-related books, and the author's actually going to come. A guy named Kelsey Timmerman, who wrote a book called Where Am I Wearing? It's an economic look at how the garment industry has changed and where clothing and things come from and what the impacts are. So he's going to come and visit with the book club. So we have books available if you want to check one out, but they're also online on Kindle and stuff like that. So feel free. And with that, I think I will not read Dr. Miller's speech. I will read my introduction. Okay.
We didn't need it because we needed these people.
Well, but I'm going to because I got some new stuff here I made up. This is Professor Howard Miller. He's a native of Texas. He has a BA in music and an MA in history from what is now the University of North Texas. In 1970, he received his PhD in American intellectual history from the University of Michigan. For a couple years in the early 70s, he taught as an assistant professor at Hope College up in Holland, Michigan, because he likes snow. In 1971, he actually returned to Texas, joining the staff at the University of Texas at Austin, where he taught the history of religion in America for almost 40 years. He served as a University Distinguished Teaching Professor of History and Religious Studies, and he held a lot of administrative positions at UT over the years as well there. I won't go into all the awards he won for teaching, but there's a lot of them if you Google him. He has, in 2009, he received one of the inaugural system-wide awards for teaching excellence in Texas, the region's Outstanding Teaching Award. He retired in 2011, and he has continued to lecture widely and continues to research all things Ben-Hur, which, if you're from Crawfordsville, you know that. He's given a lot of programs here, but also he's given programs on Ben-Hur across the country, truly. So he's always exploring different aspects of the novel and its characters. He's authored several articles and a book called Revolutionary College, American Presbyterian Higher Education, 1707 to 1837. He got it right.
No, that is just
one of the last things that he wrote that we have for sale in our gift shop, hint, hint, is a chapter in a book called Bigger Than Ben-Hur that looks at many ways that Ben-Hur has influenced popular culture and Christianity. Speaking in Crawfordsville is a natural fit for Dr. Miller with Wabash College just up the street. To quote something that I saw when he retired, it's a liberal arts education that will be worthwhile to 44-year-olds who wake up without a clue as to what they want to do with their lives. Because it's liberal arts education that teaches people to understand the variety and complexity of the human experience. So I think that's a great testimony for liberal arts. When he did his final lecture at UT, at University of Texas, and we're not going to do this tonight, but a jazz band played him out playing When the Saints Go Marching In. This is a quiet, shy little person here. But I think it was a fitting end.
Imagine my surprise.
I think it sounds like it was a fitting end for an acclaimed professor who helped build the university's religious studies department, really from ground zero, and has just influenced generations, truly, of students in religion and American culture. So without any further ado, Dr. Howard Miller.
like that before. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I was told to bring sun. I tried. I don't know how many people, most of you, I think you've heard me lecture before, most of you. But I have a couple of things to tell you. I'm 77 years old, and I don't want to sound like an old man, but I've had a lot of medical stuff in the last, since I was here in March, I guess. I had the cataracts removed, great, and I have a new implant. Now, why do I need to tell you that? Well, now that I have my cataracts removed, I can read my lecture and see you too. I used to have to do it with my computer glasses, and it would drive me nuts. I would drop into So I'm still getting adjusted. So if I fall over, Dale will catch me. Okay? Then if I all of a sudden, I just bit myself and got that implant. All right. I first want to thank Stephanie for helping me out today. And she is going to, we have some new equipment, and she has been kind of freed up, and she is going to do my slide advance for me. And I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. We haven't practiced this, so if it messes up, it's her fault. Then, every once in a while, you're going to see one of these pictures come up. It's going to be all of a sudden glorious oil paintings from the late 19th century. There are about 6 of them, I guess, in this lecture. They are from the Ben-Hur Stereopticon, Magic Lantern show. And I think you're going to have a Magic Lantern person. That's kind of why I did anyhow. That's what all that is. All righty? And I think that may be it. Larry took a lot of time to give me an introduction, and I have my lecture, and I want to read it, whether it takes a long time or not. No tests, is your hour, so let's say. Here we go. The subtitle. Oh, you made it work. I didn't know if you'd be able to. Well, already, thank you. I didn't know if it's going to I didn't even notice that. Long story. I changed my lecture topic, and I didn't tell her. So she made me this wonderful new thing, but it had the wrong title on it. But she worked in it. Isn't that, guys? Mine is just black and white. All right. Well, as you can see, the subtitle of my lecture tonight is Victorian Travelers and Tourists. And is there a difference between travelers and tourists? Well, yes, there is. To travel is simply to get from one place to another. But to be a tourist is to travel with intent, for pleasure and entertainment, to have fun, to get away for a while, to further your education. In short, to broaden your horizons and to stretch yourself. Here is an example of the difference. When I drive the 220 miles from Austin, Texas to my hometown in Graham, Texas, I am a traveler. But when I am in Graham, I am not a tourist. I haven't quite decided what I am yet here in Crawfordsville. I'm still working on it. Some of you may remember that I discovered Ben-Hur while traveling by listening to the wonderful audio version of the novel while dutifully driving from Austin to visit my aging mama in Graham. I did not expect to encounter delight on that very boring trip, but there it was. I discovered Ben-Hur. As a result of that trip, the past 20 years of my life have been transformed, and I have in effect found a second home with you wonderful people here in Crawfordsville. I have learned an important lesson from traveling from that experience. The results of traveling can be surprising and at times full of grace. By the way, that experience was not the only surprising thing that has happened to me on that stretch of US 281. A few years ago, at about 3 o'clock on a beautiful spring Sunday, just north of Hyco, Texas, which claims to be the real place where Billy the Kid died and is buried, thank you very much, I saw coming toward me on the shoulder of the highway a middle-aged man carrying a cross on rollers. I didn't have a camera with me at the time, and this was well before cell phones, but on a whim, I recently Googled Man carrying cross on rollers on highway. And what I found came very close to looking exactly what I saw.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I think that may be the same man because I think I recognize the terrain around Hyco, Texas. But back to travelers and tourists. Have you ever seen a man carrying a cross on rollers? Yeah. I first need to tell you that I decided to limit the scope of my lecture, which originally included Ben-Hur. I'm going to limit it just to Lew and Susan and leave Judah until a later lecture. Also, I'm going to talk more about Sue than Lew tonight. And we'll try to briefly make a few points about each of the Wallaces as tourists and travelers. But then at greater length, I want to try to make a single but admittedly speculative point about each of them. Finally, I'm going to assume that you have all read Stephanie's masterful overview of a Wallace's travels that surrounds us tonight. If you haven't, shame on you, do it. So, as Americans who both traveled and wrote about it, the Wallaces lived in a particularly propitious time. Lew and Susan did most of their publishing in the 1880s, the high point, or the nadir, of what historians used to call the Gilded Age, the post-war period in which, especially in the increasingly urbanized North, the economy boomed and produced a group of super-rich businessmen and tycoons, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who came to be called robber barons, and who benefited from a period of income inequality, or even they produced it, that was unmatched until our own second Gilded Age. Very few of these men, however, had been born to wealth, and they immediately sought ways to demonstrate and to signify their amazing success and social standing. The result was an outburst of spending that the sociologist Thorstein Veblen, in a landmark study called The Theory of the Leisure Class, described as conspicuous consumption. They built huge houses like Cornelius Vanderbilt's Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, and the Breakers on Millionaires Road in Newport, Rhode Island, which, by the way, Veblen used to illustrate his point about conspicuous consumption. You've seen these things? You've been seeing Millionaires Road? They're rich and you're not. Veblen particularly emphasized what he called conspicuous leisure consumption. One of the leisure activities that he discusses is the focus of my lecture tonight, taking vacations that involve extensive travel, both nationally and international, and requiring expenditures of big bucks. Travel and tourism today is a $1 trillion business. It is a major component of the global economy and is one of the most significant forces driving globalization. That industry, if I can call it that, was born in the second half of the 19th century and had its origins in the grand tour tradition of the 17th and 18th centuries. Aristocratic young men and finally women marked their coming of age by taking the grand tour of the major cities and sites on the continent. In the late Victorian period, that aristocratic grand tour tradition was democratized and became available in some form or another to an increasingly large part of the upper middle class that had been produced in the United States and Western Europe by the maturing Industrial Revolution. The boom in both national and international travel in the United States was facilitated by several simultaneous developments. Perhaps the most significant were technological developments in advance in modes of travel, empowered first by steam and then by coal. Coffee is the one that Susan and Lew took their first trip to Europe. Those advances also made possible the creation of the 19th century far-flung British Empire. By 1900, English language had become the lingua franca of much of the world. That's an important point, actually, for travel, because it made it possible for English-speaking people to travel abroad with some assurance that they would be understood at least by someone everywhere. And if they didn't understand you, probably didn't want to go there. The laying of the transatlantic cable then made it possible to communicate over heretofore unimagined distances. So they could make travel arrangements. You couldn't just call them up, but you could do the telegraph now. Then the adoption of universal time zones. You thought about that? 1880s. ensured that you could keep up with the time wherever you were. And you could have some confidence that once you made plans, they could actually be carried out according to something approaching a schedule. And finally, companies like Thomas Cook's Tours emerged to provide detailed travel arrangements, and enterprising men like Carl Baedeker, recognize that name, and John Murray, I didn't know that name, provided exhaustive and exhausting detailed guides to what to see and do in the most popular vacation spots on the globe. Interestingly enough, every one of those books were read. Wonder why? Maybe so you can keep up with it. Your little red Baedeker book, that's what you had to have if you went abroad. But what about those folks who were not wealthy enough to conspicuously consume leisure by traveling? For those, a parallel industry emerged that was made up of writers and publishers who produced travel books and guides for what came to be called the armchair traveler or tourist. Pastors, especially like the Reverend W.M. Thompson, in his wildly popular tome, The Land in the Book, wrote seemingly countless studies of the Holy Land. They were illustrated with black and white etchings, like this one of biblical Bethlehem, and this one of biblical Bethany.
I'm going the wrong way.
There we go.
Say what?
Good job.
We're good.
Okay. Early photographs of the Holy Land, like this one of 19th century Bethany. There you go. Susan Wallace once called the Judean landscape the fifth gospel. And the pervasiveness of these illustrations show us how that might have looked to be the truth, because they were everywhere. I remember distinctly as a little boy thinking that illustrations like these that appeared in my precious King James Bible with this little red cover were part of the Word of God. I thought the pictures were inspired. Other literary types, of course, wrote works of fiction that were set in the biblical Holy Land, books like Ben-Hur. The writings of Lew and Susan Wallace are part of this armchair tourism business. The General's Tale of the Christ is the best known of the novels set in biblical Judea, and has the distinction of being the only one that features the Son of God as a principal character. Moreover, Lew, after his return from Turkey, made extensive lecture tours that featured lengthy lectures on Mexico and the Mexicans, and Turkey and the Turks. Susan's first book was The Land of the Pueblos, which was the memoir of the few months that she spent in Santa Fe while Lew was the governor of the territory of New Mexico. But as she knows, she also published 3 books based on her travels during her years in Constantinople with the General: The Storied Sea, On the Bosphorus, and The Repose to Egypt. I have now read all of those books. I never read them before. I never read a word Susan wrote until we started talking about traveling. And I thought, I'm finally going to read all of those books. Well, I haven't been the same yet since. Because all of a sudden, I thought I knew just a whole lot about Lew Wallace. But then I put him in the perspective of his lady. And it has really transformed the way I look at things. If you've had glaucoma, cataract surgery, you know that it gives you a way to look at the new world with new eyes. Well, Sue kind of did that with my academic pursuits here. The writings of the Wallaces have several things in common with other Victorian travel writers. They lived at the height of the age of imperialism that saw Western powers establish sway over virtually the entire globe. There had never been anything like it. Wrong, forget it. Victorians expended a great deal of energy trying to understand the suddenly quite obvious complexities of the human race. How are you going to understand that? How to respond to these others, almost all of whom were of a different race. The Victorians were the first people on a broad scale to actually have to face that, because technological developments were bringing them all together for the first time and giving you access and the wherewithal to actually see them. The Wallaces were part of a late Victorian Anglo elite that attempted to understand the bewildering variety of the peoples of the world by reducing their complexities to a few defining characteristics by which they could be understood. As a result, however, both Wallaces, but especially Susan, can sound at times like racist and religious bigots. And it's quite a shock, actually. That, however, only marks them as people of their time. I used to just love it when I was teaching all these hundreds and thousands of kids, when they would read about somebody they really admired in the 16th century, and all of a sudden they came out with the most racist and bigoted statements, and how could they believe that? Wonderful teaching opportunity. Because then you say, well, tell me, what do you think about fill in blank? Fill in blank. For a while it was gay marriage. You know, and back then people were still falling out about it. But then they would say, well, I can't think of anything. I can't think of anything that would make people 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 100, but how could they believe that? Climate change? How could they have been so stupid? How could they have been so stupid? But Larry mentioned a while ago that one of the things that the liberal arts do is to teach you the variety and complexities of the human condition, to learn, to really understand the variety, myriads of ways that people over the ages have found to be human. So, I had to practice on Sue about that, because she is so gracious and gentle, and she can just curl your hair, if I had to. In the final analysis, though, Lew and Susan both value toleration and respect for others above all other virtues, period. Like most Westerners at the time, they believed in a common humanity created by a single true God. A belief that is central to Ben-Hur. All the wise men coming together, all different religions, here they're coming together. What are they going to do? Worship the Son of the one true God. It was also epitomized by the convening of the World Parliament of Religions at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. How many of you ever heard of that before? You've heard of it? Okay. It's fascinating. A gathering that the general enthusiastically applauded. Ben-Hur begins with 3 holy men, I just said this, from the corners of the known world, gathering to witness the birth of the Son of the Christian God, the one true God. The World Parliament of Religions, which included Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Theosophists, Buddhists, you have it, in addition to Christians, concluded with a rousing performance of the Hallelujah Chorus. You say, oh, I think all this toleration is wonderful. Hallelujah. The kingdoms of the world are become the kingdoms of the Lord and of his Christ. Hallelujah. You don't get much more Christian than that. But if you can kind of balance the urge to dabble with complexity, whatever, and then also Christianity's got to be over all of it, right? That's as far as they've gotten. But that's further than lots of people had at the time. Actually, more than lots of people have here. Oh, yes. Both Wallaces are quite critical of the Spanish conquest of the New World, which they often express in terms that can sound anti-Catholic. Although Lew, in his lecture on Mexico and the Mexicans, was very careful to point out that his criticism of the Spanish conquest of Mexico did not imply in any way criticism of the American Catholic Church, and in ways that make their travel writings particularly relevant today. Both Lew and Susan Wallace discuss what? Muslims on the one hand and Mexicans on the other. How au courant, can you? I hadn't even thought about that until I wrote this little talk. It's fascinating. The Wallaces also, like so many other travel writers, occasionally overwhelm the reader with detailed descriptions of the places and subjects they discuss. I had a fascinating experience reading Land of the Pueblos. While reading Susan's very detailed portrait of what she called the forbidding desolation of a section of southwestern landscape, it's by Costa Grande, I came to a paragraph and when Susan described a few scrubby trees that marked the edge of the plain as if they had looked across the waterless waste and crouched in fear. What a wonderful phrase. Stunning trees that crouch in fear. Now that, wait read that before. Think, Miller. Okay, Ben-Hur. Introduction. In the introduction to Ben-Hur, as the general describes the Judean desert into which the Egyptian Balthazar the wise man is hurrying on his great white camel, first Sue, here is Lew. Lew said, "The oak, bramble, and arbutus lay behind, as if they had come to a line, looked over into the waterless waste, and crouched in fear." Now, the fact of the matter is that we don't know when Susan Wallace wrote those words. You don't know. You don't know actually when Lew wrote that particular part of Ben-Hur. It could have been about the same time. Question, who wrote first? Actually, I'm going to have to try to figure that one out, but okay. See, I haven't read all of Susan Wallace. I wouldn't know that. Neither would you. Much more diminished your life would be. All right, enough about generalizations. What is to be said about Susan Elson Wallace specifically as a traveler, tourist, and as a travel writer? Well, the first thing I noticed about Susan Wallace's travel memoirs was the quality of the writing. Who knew? Wallace was well educated, and not just for a mid-19th century woman. She was well educated. In fact, she was much better educated than her husband was. He never got over it out in the field. I was amazed at the number of writers that Susan references, and at the skill with which she makes biblical and classical allusions. At one point, I started keeping a list of the writers she references. I noted William Prescott, about Mexico, Sir Walter Raleigh, Herodotus, Byron, Scott, Bulwer Lytton, Dickens, the inevitable Shakespeare, Tennyson, Gibbon, George Eliot. Then I stopped counting. But the references don't call attention to themselves, as the generals too often do. Susan Wallace wears her learning modestly and unself-consciously. Mrs. Wallace is well-read and well-educated, and she assumes that her readers are too. She doesn't condescend to them for a moment. She quotes whole passages in the French, no translation. She flatters her readers and tells them they don't really need a guide. She seems to assume that her readers know what she's about to say, but assures them that not knowing is no problem. In a way, I find difficult to explain. Susan Wallace seems to be in tune with the places and peoples she describes. She seems to respond to them personally. Lew, in contrast, more frequently uses the characters and situations he describes to make an analytical, strategic, or historical point, which just makes him say she's a woman, he's a man, the 19th century. Susan Wallace is an altogether gracious and generous guide, which unfortunately tends to make even more jarring some of her remarks that make the modern reader cringe. And I want to talk about that for a minute and make a suggestion about it. I started reading Wallace's travel books with the land of the Pueblos and her experiences in territorial Santa Fe. I doubt territorial Santa Fe ever will.
Sorry. I was one behind you, I think.
Okay, all right. Her comments about the Indians and Mexicans she encountered were almost unreservedly critical and negative. Can I get a witness? But those comments were not based on skin color, not particularly. It was clearly the people's demeanor that so profoundly and uniformly disturbed the governor's wife. The words she used to describe that demeanor are instructive. The Indians were apathetic, sluggish, passive, dull, monotonous. Repeatedly, Wallace comments on the intolerably fixed gaze that made the natives appear to be unreachable and unknowable. And they were always so very still. One of Wallace's favorite adjectives for the natives was dumb, by which she did not mean stupid, but preternaturally still and silent. Well, I think about that. And then I remembered early 19th century Europeans visiting the New America and the New Americans. The visitors complained that the Americans were constantly staring at them. But it quickly becomes clear that the almost always aristocratic Europeans were not accustomed to having their inferiors looking at them without deferentially averting their gaze. And I think that's what, she couldn't connect with them because they won't look at her. She's not there. Is Susan Wallace a middle child? I hadn't thought about that. Is she a middle child?
She was.
Perfect middle child. Look at me, tell me where I am. Come on, that's me. As she encounters other national groups in her travels, Wallace finds ways to distinguish them from each other and emphasizes the things that they have in common. For instance, the Greeks are the most beautiful race, the Egyptians the strongest race. While the Arabs are crafty and courteous, the Turks are the most tolerant of mortals, and the Jews are always eager to sell you something. The Zunis are the Yankees of the Pueblos.
There you go.
I love that. And the Apaches are the American Bedouins. The only thing they all have in common is that they never change. Never change. Drove her crazy. Wallace's own life experience had taught her that change is the only inevitable thing. She's an American. She's going. Striving. A people's capacity to change appears to be one of its most commendable qualities to Susan Wallace. But in the American Southwest and in the Eastern Mediterranean world, Wallace encountered ancient cultures that seemed incapable of change. At several points in the land of the Pueblos, Wallace reports that the Indians set their face like flint against change. And that is the one thing for which Mrs. Wallace will simply not forgive them. Susan also does not enjoy roughing it on her travels. She eloquently recounts the miseries of traveling by creaky buckboard and balky mule in the American Southwest, and some of those memorable passages in her her writings relieve her miserable battles with seasickness. Lew was just blowing and glowing. She just bleh. And don't get us started on camels. The general may have romantically described the Magi's 3 white camels in Ben-Hur as majestic and noble beasts, but in the sharp and unsentimental eyes of his wife, camels are simply mangy, dreary creatures to be avoided. Oh, she hated them. Susan's treatment of the people she encounters in her travel in and around the Mediterranean is noticeably less harsh and critical than her treatment of the American Indians or Mexicans. One cannot help but wonder if the fact that the wife of the American minister to the Ottoman Empire always traveled first class was one of the reasons for that difference. In The Repose in Egypt, she addresses the issue explicitly as she describes her luxurious mode of transportation to the pyramid. Quote, instead of donkeying to the pyramids or perched on a black back-breaking camel, you ride in an open barouche to the very foot of the Great Pyramid. It is a delicious ride, she said. Just so. Now, complicated point. Unlike her husband, Susan does not ride as an armchair tourist. She has traveled herself in the places she describes to her readers. But the general, of course, had not seen the Holy Land when he wrote Ben-Hur. And he always seems to be more than just a little defensive about the fact after the novel became so wildly popular. Because by 1880, bunches of people had been to the news, so they began to assume that Wallace had too. You're like, well, no, didn't do that. I've always suspected that Wallace accepted Garfield's appointment to the Ottoman Empire because he would finally be able to travel to Jerusalem and test the accuracy of his descriptions of at least the topography of the region. And as you know from reading the text of the current exhibit, Lew was quite pleased with what he discovered, thank you very much. He pronounced, perhaps a little defensively, quote, I found the descriptive details true to the existing objects and scenes, and I find no reason for making a single change to the text of the book. No, Susan saw the scene first and then wrote the book. Susan Wallace uses humor in her writings. At one point in the land of the Pueblos, she describes a gathering of Indians that featured music and dancing. As the gathering became more and more raucous, several local dogs added their howls to the commotion, whereupon, Susan dryly observes, the powwow became a bow wow. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Susan apparently loathed any and all forms of non-Western music. The music of the Pueblos, for instance, drove her crazy. Then at one point, and this is my favorite, at one point of the gospel, she asked her reader, "Didst ever hear Arab music, beloved? No? Then thou hast never truly suffered." Oh, we wouldn't read that. Susan Wallace can create with very few words images that are as powerful as anything in the general's writings. For instance, an older woman had wrinkles deep enough to bury her youth in. At sunset one evening on her journey to the turquoise mines in Cerrillos, New Mexico, Susan chances upon a landscape that takes her breath away because of its total and complete silence and lack of movement anywhere. And she said, it is the one place in which I have stood where the earth is as still as the sky. Or how about this line describing her efforts to get to sleep under the stars with Lew in the dry air of the New Mexico high desert? She said, the air was so electric that 5 lines of fire followed my fingers as I drew them across the buffalo miles. Is that alliteration or onomatopoeia? It's alliteration, right? 5 fingers of fire followed.
Alliteration.
I'm retired. I got the point there, it's alliteration. Susan Wallace, occasionally in her travel memoirs, reflects on traveling and tourism and on writing about the subject. It is one of the ways in which she so effectively connects with her readers. It's my impression that Lew does not spend much time in his writings reflecting on these matters. He does in fact, in the lecture on Mexico and Mexicans, declare that the chief effect of travel is to liberalize us. You know what? I don't think it did for him. I think by the time he died, he was much more chauvinistic than he ever had been. And I think his travels had something to do with it. That's my opinion. Okay. Susan does so much more. At the beginning of the story, Susan and her shipmate, Thalia, discuss the various approaches to writing about travel and agree that Susan should not imitate the accurate figures traveler who saw the Sphinx at 11 o'clock, August 21st, 1875, and climbed up a ladder with 10,000 rounds and measured its nose, and it was exactly 5 feet and 6 inches long. Also to be avoided was the deep bore, who reports that after a restless night, rose and looked out, weather rainy and cold, next day, same. Susan speaks of her intention to write for working women who can never travel themselves, to help them bear the tedium and stress of daily existence. Hear now as she bonds with her beloved reader at one point. Dear reader, you do not know, you never can know, till we change places, how glad I am to catch your friendly eyes again. The sights are but half seen, the sounds but half heard. Without you, connect. Middle child. I'm serious. Middle child. Sue's writing also contains useful tips about traveling and touring. First of all, pace yourself. Take it easy. And settle into the sites that you're visiting. Susan also warned that historic and scenic sites are rapidly changing or even disappearing. Guess there before what you want to see is gone. Finally, she noted that travel can be hard on relationships. Take care of and take care with your traveling companions. But it must be admitted, Susan Wallace was a bit of a travel snob, especially when it came to what she called derisively the cookies. Those often middle-class tourists who could not afford to travel first class, as Mrs. Wallace did, and went on Cook's tours. You know, they still do Cook's tours? Beautiful posters. She often commented snidely at the way in which the cookies hurried from site to site, Baedekers or Murray guides in hand, often gawking at the natives, even if they were elegant Parisians, as in some. There you go. Often gawking at these natives, even if here this is elegant Parisian, right? But look how poor they all look. Now, that's a perfect example of her snide views of the middle class tourist. Now, I would like to try to make one single important but admittedly subjective point about Susan Wallace as a traveler and tourist. Folks, no one has ever done this before, and it's just entirely me. Like any well-bred, and it involves the general, like any well-bred Victorian lady, Sue almost always traveled in the company of her husband. But one of the first things I noticed about her travel writing is that the general, though present in the flesh, is almost absent always from the narrative. He's simply never there. Mind you, Susan Wallace almost never traveled alone, and especially in the 3 Mediterranean memoirs, her traveling companions become primary actors. She's with them all the time. She travels with her sister, Joanna Lane, a friend called simply Thalia, a pretentious older male whom she calls rather sarcastically the antiquary and makes fun of, and a wide variety of fellow travelers who appear briefly in her tales and then disappear. But by my count, and I did it for all of those pages, I'm looking for Lew, but by my count, Mrs. Wallace mentions her husband's presence only 3 times in 4 books. At one point, while the couple sleeps under the stars in New Mexico, Susan identifies Lew as, quote, my traveling companion on the journey of life, but you'd never know that he was around. And on 2 other occasions, the author of Ben-Hur appears briefly when, while touring in the Mediterranean, Sue asks him if this or that side appears to be as he always imagined it. The answer was, yes. The husband's exclusion from the narrative works finally to create the impression that Susan Wallace is a single woman courageously and confidently moving through the world alone. The effect is so striking that I came to wonder if the author created it intentionally, and then I read a chapter near the end of The Repose in Egypt called One Woman, a Romance. It is about a woman so notorious for her scandalous life that Susan calls her only Lady Ellen, and assumes that the reader will instantly recognize the subject of the tale. Well, I did not, and it almost drove me crazy to figure it out. But finally I determined that Susan had, during her stay in Constantinople, begun to hear from missionaries and others the story of Lady Jane Digby, Lady Ellenbrook, and what a tale it was.
There we go.
There she is.
Yeah, thank you. I keep forgetting that they're even there. It's just wonderful to see how, well, anyhow. Okay, Jane Digby, Lady Ellenbrook, and the fictional name is Lady Ellen. Get it? All right. But I'm going to use them simultaneously. Jane Digby, I told you, this is the point that's going to be made in some detail. Jane Digby was a well-born Englishwoman who was married 4 times and had affairs with a well-known diplomat, a Greek general, the king of Greece himself, and Ludwig I of Bavaria. She spoke 8 languages, and in 1835 she traveled to Arabia and fell in love first with the desert and then with the real-life Arabian sheik, Majnun el-Razak, who was 20 years her junior. This is a real photograph of her. It's really very good, but it's really nice. She learned Arabic as her 9th language, Pushi, I think. Married the sheik and adopted native dress and customs, and for the last 30 years of her life, spent 6 months in the tents of the sheik in the desert, and the rest of the year in her villa in Damascus, where you can still go, where she died in 1881, the year in which the Wallaces arrived in Constantinople. But Jane Digby was but one of the several high-born English women who in the 19th and early 20th century went native in the sands of Arabia, sort of female equivalents of the celebrated but notorious Sir Richard Burton. Taken together, the stories of these women constitute what might be called the British Queen of the Desert tradition. The tradition could be said to begin with Lady Hester Stanhope, who spent her adult life as first a pioneering archaeologist in the ancient port city of Ascalon, south of Jaffa, and then in various locations in what is now Lebanon, where she acquired significant political influence before becoming a recluse. Lady Stanhope was a solitary figure, never married, and figures prominently in Wallace's chapter on Lady Digby. She has even become, in the 21st century, the subject of a graphic adventure series. Ellen Georgiana Tanner was among the first women to travel solo in the Holy Land and established a career as a collector of Persian and Arabian art. Isabella Bird, love this picture, talk about Queen of the Desert. Isabella Bird was perhaps the best-known female explorer of the Victorian era and ended her exploring career in the deserts of North Africa. Bird was the first woman elected to the Royal Geographic Society. The Queen of the Desert tradition culminated spectacularly in the career of Gertrude Bell, about whom some of you may have heard, who cooperated with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, in the Arab revolts against the Ottoman Empire in the First World War and was central to the British efforts to create the state of Iraq in the 1920s. Now, I would like to suggest that the British Queen of the Desert tradition was enormously appealing to Susan Wallace. The chapter devoted to Lady Jane's story is, at 43 pages, one of the longest Wallace wrote in any of her memoirs. Susan rather perfunctorily raises a Victorian eyebrow at Lady Ellen's scandalous number of husbands and love affairs, but she is clearly titillated by the freedom of movement and choice that Jane Digby exercised throughout her life. She quotes a friend of Lady Ellen, who speaks of Digby's romantic desire to become Queen of the Desert. Wallace describes the way in which Lady Ellen serves as something of us like a spark that enlivened any community that she became part of. At one point, Wallace describes Digby as she travels with her entourage from Damascus to Cairo, where Digby apparently retained the upper hand at all times in any bargaining over any purchase and always gets exactly what she wants. Now, I really had to think about, why is Susan so fascinated by the way this woman shops? Well, the episode probably has special appeal for Susan Wallace because she never quite got over having been sold a worthless piece of rock as a valuable piece of turquoise, and she sent it off to Boston to be set, and the children sent it back in crumbs, by a particularly crafty merchant in New Mexico. Wallace at times called Lady Ellen my queen of the blue eyes and this electric woman. She admits at one point that I have a sort of liking for this soft, tame leopardess full of tiger blood. Now, folks, I don't have any idea if there's any relationship between the absence of Wallace's husband in these travel accounts and her obvious fascination, obvious fascination, with a woman that insists that she be in unquestioned charge of every aspect of her life. But I do know that in reading every page of Susan Wallace's travel memoirs, I never saw her so clearly captivated by any of the stories that she told. Reading Wallace's travel books, in fact, put me in mind of another teller of tales about the deserts of Arabia. Who might I be talking about? Of course, Scheherazade, the narrator of 1001 Arabian Nights. I suspect that the rather episodic and even disjointed nature of at least two of the travel memoirs reflects their origin as discrete periodical contributions. But especially in the repose in Egypt, the echoes of the Arabian Nights and its bewitching narrator are quite powerful. Susan also, in some vague way, came to remind me of the Scheherazade of Ben-Hur, Iris the Egyptian, who on two occasions in the novel spins exotic tales to the smitten Judah Ben-Hur. On the Lake of the Orchard of Palms, Iris recounts the tragic tale of Nini Hofra, And later, at the oasis in the desert, she tells Judah the marvelous tale of how the beautiful came to the earth, which remains for me one of the general's best efforts. It's probably the best set piece in all of Ben-Hur. What about the general? And this is much briefer, much more brief, whatever. The first thing to be said about Lew Wallace and travel is that for the general, travel was almost always work. Lew was at various points in his life a lawyer, a soldier, a politician, a diplomat, and finally a lecturer. Wearing all of those different hats required him to spend days, weeks, months, even years on the road and away from home. And when he was traveling, I rarely get the sense that Lew Wallace was a tourist in our sense of the word. When he was in New Mexico, I have the impression that he spent any free time he might have had in scouting out prospective mining properties to buy. In Mexico, both in the Mexican War and in the aftermath of the Civil War, he approached Mexico and the Mexicans in terms of public policy and strategy. His movements during the Civil War itself were, of course, dictated by military necessity and commanders. When he served on the two post-war commissions and on the committee that oversaw the contested election of 1876, he traveled in the defeated and desolate South and had little time for anything other than his official duties. When he traveled to Boston and D.C. to research Ben-Hur, he was working. When he traveled to Jerusalem with Susan, one of his primary goals was to establish the accuracy of that research. He was working. But we do know one thing about his response to traveling, his reaction to riding the rails as a lecturer in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The response can be summed up easily. He hated it. Over a period of fewer than 10 years, the general traveled the Chautauqua Lyceum lecture circuit and appeared before appreciative audiences in many of the same cities that would later play host to the traveling stage version of Ben-Hur. He competed on these other late Victorian he competed on these tours with other late Victorian celebrities such as Robert Ingersoll, the great infidel. This is actually a photograph. It's a very rare photograph, about 1992. He's talking outside at this point about anarchy and free thought and everything. Oscar Wilde, very popular, but most especially Mark Twain, who was probably the most popular of all of them and made buckets of money on the lecture circuit. I think that was the reason that Lew didn't like he didn't make buckets of money. But you know what we really hated about it? He told Sue this. I remembered this. He hated that at the end of every day, some little old local came up and paid him. Some nobody paid Lew Wallace $30 or something like that. The officer said, "Bet you're glad to see me." He mentions it several times. He was a proud man, in case you hadn't noticed. Wallace's tours focused on what came to be called the Ben-Hur circuit in the Ohio River Valley and the Northern Plains states, with an occasional tour of the West Coast in Canada. The general usually worked with either James C. Redpath or with Colonel James B. Pond. His almost daily correspondence with his agents conveyed graphically the difficulties of making connections in the pioneer days of train travel as standard time zones haltingly and spottedly went into effect. Folks, there are virtually no references to pleasure and sightseeing in that very extensive correspondence. It was all work for Lew, and he treated his lecture tours as pure business arrangements, which is to say, he is often singularly unattractive. Short-tempered, demanding and exacting, occasionally imperious and fiercely protective of his own financial interest. But let me show you what Wallace was up against. Let me read you, I'm going to read it to you, a typical message from the Redpath Lyceum Bureau to Lew, who is out on the rails trying as best he can to make connections in these very early days of rail travel. Can you actually read this? Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to read it to you. Stephanie Mann did a great job of this. This is from the guy he's somewhere, I think he's in Cincinnati, and he's writing there every day, or telegraph, anyhow. Okay, so he says, as before suggested, you had better spend Sunday, May the 8th in Omaha, so as to leave that night via Mopac for Leavenworth. You will go from Burlington, Kansas to Kansas City and spend the night there, taking the 7 o'clock train next morning via Wabash for Columbia. This is my favorite. From Fulton, you better run down to St. Louis and spend the 17th. I think you can get in there at 5:40 p.m. via Jeff City and Bopac Railroad. If not, you can get there at 6 p.m. anyway. Then you can leave St. Louis via Ohio and Mississippi River at Railroad at 8 p.m., reaching Madison all right. No wonder that he's 60 years old. No wonder he's exhausted. Can you imagine? I mean, I really just can't imagine. And he wrote his wife almost daily, almost crying. And it is in those letters that his level of his unhappiness with travel became quite clear. Hear him writing to Sue from Cook's Hotel, Rochester, Minnesota, January 28, 1887. I send you some papers in a separate envelope. They will show you that my grind, his daily lecture, keeps new to the audiences, although, alas, is so monotonous to me. The new audience is all that saves me from suicide every night. The end suggests itself every conclusion of the lecture. Little wonder then that for vacation for Lew Wallace was not traveling. He plaintively tells his wife repeatedly, it's so sad, how much he longs to be at home with her. And when he does finally take a vacation away from his home in the Elston Grove, with the single exception of a vacation with Sue at the Kenilworth Inn in Asheville, North Carolina, thank you, Larry, he doesn't go far. Perhaps he goes to his home away from home, his beloved houseboat, the Thing, on the Kankakee River, or later in his life, at his country place at Water Babel. In the last few years of his life, he occasionally ventured as far as Burt Lake in the northern reaches of the lower peninsula of Michigan. It was there that the general was taken very ill in late 1904. It was his last vacation. Now, in conclusion, just as I attempted to do with Susan and her response to Lady Ellen and the British Queen of the Desert tradition, I would like to tell you about an impression I have had about one result of the general's travels abroad. As most of you know, Lew Wallace carried through most of his life the scar of the wound to his military reputation as a result of the Union's near defeat on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. Let me suggest that General Wallace was also deeply wounded by the failure of the American elite, men like William Dean Howells, to receive the author of Ben-Hur as one of their own. The literary journals hardly reviewed the book even. And it really shocked and it deeply wounded him. In Europe, however, as a celebrated author of an international bestseller and as a high-level American diplomat, Lew Wallace found that he had instant entree into the most exclusive ranks of the thriving American and British expatriate communities everywhere. Distinguished and cultivated men and women who almost universally received the general and his wife warmly and respectfully. Once again, I could never prove it, but I have the sense that this result of his travels had something to do with the undeniable way in which Lew Wallace managed to come to terms with some of his inner demons in the last decade or so of his life. Without appearing presumptuous, I hope, I would like to suggest that as I encountered unexpectedly delights while routinely traveling to see my mama, Lew Wallace received an unexpected life gift from his travel abroad. And here it is. I'm thinking of two men in particular. One, an American Yankee blue blood, and the other, a for real British aristocrat. First, the American. William Wetmore Story, the son of Joseph Story, an associate justice of the Supreme Court and himself descended from Yankee blue bloods, was an American expat who was both a Yankee aristocrat as well as a noted writer and sculptor. He had something of a reputation as a poet and essayist and eventually became one of the most sought-after sculptors of his time, known especially for The Angel of Grief, which he made for his wife's grave in a Protestant cemetery in Rome. He and his wife lived in Baroque splendor in a huge apartment in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome, where they regularly convened perhaps the most sparkling of all the Italian salons, in which gathered the most glittering literary and artistic names in the late 19th century. Robert Browning, for instance, was in attendance when Susan and Lew showed up at the Palazzo for the first time. The Wallaces quickly became close friends of both Mr. and Mrs. Story, who reportedly read aloud to each other the copy of Ben-Hur that the general presented to them. They repeatedly lauded the book as a singular literary achievement. Susan wrote a warmly affectionate study of William Whitmer's Story in Along the Bosphorus. Story often called Susan Mrs. Ben-Hur in his frequent letters to her, and Mrs. Story declared Wallace's Tale of the Christ the book of books of the age. And then there was Anglo-Irish nobleman, here's his name, nobleman, Frederick William Temple Blackwood, all hyphens, first Marquis of Dufferin and Ava, was one of England's most distinguished diplomats of the late Victorian period, as well as a best-selling writer. He was himself born abroad in Florence. They had an estate in Ireland, but with his wife, lived most of his life at increasingly important posts in the far-flung British Empire. He served first as the Governor-General of Canada. He was the ambassador to Russia. He was Wallace's diplomatic colleague in Constantinople. And, young people, he ended his career with a grand flourish as the Viceroy of India. The highest administrative post to which an Englishman could aspire in Victoria's empire. Wallace worked closely with Dufferin in Constantinople during the British takeover in Egypt, and the two men corresponded frequently after they both went their separate ways. Susan was an equally close friend of Lady Dufferin. Now, like Story, Lord Dufferin was lavish in his praise of Ben-Hur. I'm going to take the time to read to you a very important letter from this most learned, cultured, and celebrated English aristocrat. And I want you to try to imagine what his carefully chosen words might have meant to a writer who had been, in effect, snubbed by the literary elite of his own land. And I quote, "I set up the night before last to finish your beautiful book, and I assure you I find it difficult to express all my admiration of it. It is wonderful how you have interwoven the sacred elements of the story with the human interest without producing any sense of incongruity or wounding the reverential sensitiveness of the reader. All your characters live, and one takes the deepest interest in their fortunes. The spectacular descriptions are full of color, light, and exhilaration, and you have succeeded in introducing the gorgeousness of Eastern coloring with admirable force. Portions of the story are most affecting, and the sea fight and the chariot race are wonderfully dramatic. In fact, from beginning to end, I read it with breathless interest, and I delight. And I can quite understand your having received the thanks of those whom you have aided to realize, more acutely than their feeble imaginations enabled them to do, the heartbreaking incidences of the crucifixion. It is with the utmost earnestness and sincerity that I congratulate you on your great achievement. Believe me, my dear General Wallace, yours very sincerely, Dufferin." It's almost as if somehow this elegant and eloquent Englishman, who made William Dean Howells look like an uncouth provincial in comparison, he somehow knows that Wallace has been rejected by his own literary establishment, and is reminding the general that Wallace has done something much more important than win the praise of the likes of William Dean Howells. He has given to the American public a way in which they can truly identify with and respond to what was, in the eyes of Christians, the central event of human history. And it is to this wondrous novel that I will turn when next we meet. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Miller before we kind of conclude? One of the things I noticed and had not picked up on before is the fact that Lew never stayed home. He did not stay put, and yet travel was not something he sought. But he was a rolling stone. He had a very hard time.
From the very beginning.
Yeah, from childhood.
He wouldn't stay home when he's supposed to at 5 years old. Thank you for this chair, by the way.
You're welcome.
Talk to me. Yes, Mark.
So he was traveling intensely throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, but like, was it health or, but he did settle down the time he built the study, didn't he? And at that time he was more staying put.
Yes, but he was also volunteering to go fight the Spanish-American War. So he's very complicated about it.
So he really never felt like he wanted to be settled and stay put. But he perhaps designed, I'm pondering, you can answer this, but he builds the study maybe as a kind of anchor for this restless soul of his.
Oh, that's interesting. Thorsten Veblen might call it conspicuous consumption.
There may be
Interesting question. I really don't know. But, well, he was actually, as you all know, he was actually a very well-known person. And that is one of the reasons why his being snubbed by the literary establishment was so really hard for him to take, particularly after, and I'm contradicting myself, because it could be argued that his reception by the American and English expats abroad may have just made him more galled at William Dean Howells. But somehow he did conquer some of those demons, some of them. There's just no doubt that he is a more settled person. Not just older, but he's just a more settled person. He's accepted some things. He sort of made his piece about Shiloh and everything, but he was never going to be, one of the great American authors.
One of the things that Wallace did do was a number of other authors from the Midwest, because it was very frustrating to them that the Eastern power structure thought they controlled the industry. But writers in Indiana, Michigan, Illinois started the Western Writers Association to counteract what they saw as unfairness from the publishing industry on the East Coast. He was one of the members of that.
Look at you.
We do have some refreshments. Dr. Miller will be available to visit with you. But before we do that, I do want to do one thing, and Elaine should be somewhere. Several years ago, we do try to listen to the surveys and feedback from our audience, our constituents, and many years ago we heard that we wanted that folks wanted to have some more adult kind of programming, some lectures and some things like that. So we came up with the extraordinary title, the Adult Lecture Series. It just sang, just a beautiful thing. And the branding of that has carried us far. A couple of board meetings ago, our board members started wanting to find a way to recognize all that Dr. Miller had done for us over the years, through lectures and other ways. And henceforth, going forward, what you're not going to see is not the Adult Lecture Series. You're going to see the Dr. Howard Miller Lecture Series. And so look for this all over the media and CNBC media. But this is our way of recognizing what he's done for us to raise the bar for some of the educational programming that we're able to do. So, without any further ado, you just this is the first official Dr. Miller lecture series program. So we're going to have to revamp all of our stuff, and you'll see this little logo on everything as it goes out the rest of the year. So there we go. So we do have some refreshments around the corner there. And Dr. Miller was sort of is. is available to visit with
Don't
everybody.
laugh at me when I'm being infirm and pale.
Thank you for coming tonight.
It's like dried blood.